Making game ideas. Pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
But how do you take that great game idea and after deliberating for 17 months what game engine to use, and you finally considered you're going Unity or Godot, maybe not sure yet, maybe you need another few months to like...
You don't mention Unreal. Cancelled.
How do you actually go and make it a reality? And what I mean here is the structure of your game. And I am no programmer at all. I wrote like 10 lines of code for Forge Industry, and those 10 lines, I think you had to fix like 2 bugs in them. I do remember you going through my pull request, but I am here with my wonderful Thomas, who is our like lead programmer, which is a fake term if you're a team with like 2 programmers, but he's our lead programmer and like architect. And I just wanted to talk a bit about how do you get started with making a game, because we make mechanical games as well, like both Forge Industry and our upcoming guild management game, Guild Architect, are very heavy on code and mechanics, because that is our team's strength. But that's not always your strength. So we wanted to go a bit high level over what are some considerations when starting a game project with your code base, how do you plan all of it? And I asked Thomas to make a video for this originally. It was horrible, so here I am with him, and I'll like try to guide him a bit more through it with what are the things that we considered with Guild Architect and things like that.
My brain is a bit too unstructured. He wants more structure.
We're trying to be engine agnostic here, like maybe some things will be like more engine specific, but most of these lessons should apply to whether you're making an Unreal game, a Godot game, or like maybe even Game Maker Studio or Unity. We're talking about the large scale architecture, how do you get started. This is not a coding tutorial at all, so keep watching. So my big question, I think, let's just begin with the beginning. We had the idea for Guild Architect, guild management game. We give it to you. How do you get started?
The first thing I do is tell both Marnix and William to not touch the repo for like a month. And there is a reason for that, is because in the beginning there's a lot of moving parts. So if you're a solo game developer, it doesn't matter. If you work in a team, let one person do it. The first thing I did is decide on the technologies we will use.
Okay.
So for example, what render pipeline we use in Unity. Maybe in Unreal, you also have certain things. Or other things like, hey, what are the mechanics that we want in the game, like globally? We don't talk about smaller mechanics that we have decided to put in later, but like, for example,
the quest creation.
Quest creation, we need to have a grid for the creating.
Oh yeah, the grid for placing buildings.
Buildings, but also other things like, hey, what packages will we use? Like, for example, we will use the input system from Unity. All those things I feel like you should think about upfront. It's not always easy, but you should try to think in your head, hey, from start to finish, I want to make these things, this is what I need.
And your first line of code, what is your first line of code that you write? Like
nothing functional. So what I mean with that is, the first things I make are always building blocks. For example, we by now have a common package that we use for multiple games. Those are the first thing I would write if I started again.
Okay,
so things that I know I will probably reuse a ton. A simple example of this is we have a simple class for the singleton pattern, but then for Unity. For those who don't know, Marnix will probably put a link here, but basically what it means very shortly is you have one instance of that class, there's always one, no matter what, and you can easily access it using static.
So we have learned a lot in terms of software architecture for like your game as well. Forge Industry was probably like how not to approach it, but also maybe the approach that a lot of people had is we started with the game jam approach of we just write code, because right now everything you've been telling to me, it makes sense, but my God, it's boring. Like, it's not fun, because like you said, the first month there is no game, pretty much, right? There is nothing you can do. And what we did with Forge Industry was like the opposite, where immediately it was like mechanic, like put it as much together. How do you find that balance? Because I feel like if you're starting as a game developer, your first game, you're like, I know I've talked to you guys, some of you guys as well, who started working on their game and all they did was make interfaces. They had interfaces for their entire game, which is like some programming construct, but there was no game yet. Where do you strike that balance of, okay, this is actually like adding value to my game, basically?
Okay. What I didn't mean for the first month you don't write mechanics. I meant the first line of code you write are the building blocks. After that, you start working on one big feature. In our case, I started with the grid because we knew from experience we had troubles with the grid in Forge Industry for a while. So you're like, this is one of the core principles or pillars, whatever you want to call it, that we want to have there from the start. so we know it is good to build upon. So, for example, what we were very strict on and still are with Guild Architect is we write a lot of tests. This is very important because,
it's a management game as well.
Yeah, for if you're making a platformer or something, or a roguelike or whatever, you probably won't write as much tests. But if you write a management game, something very mechanic driven, just write tests for your business logic. And once you have decided on your big feature, create the base version of it. You don't have to go into depth like every mechanic, whatever. But I would first create a base for your first big mechanic, and then for your second, and so on, and then flesh them out a bit more.
Okay. One other thing that I think we did at a certain point as well, but I'm not a program guy. What about like class diagrams? Do you like plan before you actually write out the code? Do you like take like a draw.io or whatever and like plan how is everything going to come together, or is it more of an on-the-fly approach there?
I'm going to sound so scummy now.
Oh.
But if you have less experience, you should write a class diagram.
Okay.
But I feel like the concepts we use, and I think we use well and are fitting for our games, I don't have to write a class diagram for.
Okay. Let's say I am going to make my first game. What would you give me as advice of like class diagram? How in depth is it? Because once again, this is like the
Don't
struggle.
go too in depth. First of all, I split your game up in modules, is what I would say. This is something we still do. For example, we have a module for the tavern. And this is everything with the tavern we put in a folder. Generally, our folder structure is the weakest link, I feel. Just put it in a folder, and that's from now on your module. So for example, you then have a tavern manager. Don't just use a game manager, whatever. It's a bad practice to have one class do everything. Make it module specific. And then everything that is related to that, for example, tavern mechanic, put it in the tavern folder. Prefix it always with tavern in your files, and just focus on that.
So then once you have that diagram, then you can start with that like 1 month of building blocks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you then you have the tavern module, you think, what does I have to do? You just sketch it out in your class diagram then, and then you create that one. And afterwards you create your other module, and then you see, do they have to talk to each other? If that's the case, put them next to each other, see, can they do this properly already? And that's where, for example, guys with interfaces probably come from, like what do they have to do? That's the moment you try to integrate them. It's usually the hardest part. Like this is something we struggled with Forge Industry, mainly because we started from a game jam and we didn't think about it. But in the end, everything has to be one cohesive part. So if you have modules, they do have to work together. So keep that in mind when you create your class diagram, because sure, everything can work in isolation, but it has to be flexible enough to work with everything together.
So speaking about Forge Industry, that's basically talking about scope creep. A big problem as well is that there's a lot of pressure on your initial architecture, which is probably why you're watching this, because you're scared of like having the same problem as hey, you have this code base, but turns out your base is like just a pile of rubble and it's going to collapse at any point if you try to add anything on top of it. I think with Forge Industry, there was not that much expansion at the end of the day. That was like really solid. Like we wanted to add more mechanics, but it just didn't work. Can you plan for that? Or is it kind of just, I don't know, it will happen and you're kind of shit out of luck if there's like a big new mechanic that like a few months into development, once that base is there, suddenly gets joined on top of it?
I think you can plan for most of it, but there are always questions you need to think about. And those are fundamental questions that decide how your architecture functions. A very simple example is if we would say, for example, recipes in a tavern, do they have multiple quantities for an ingredient that has to be added, or is it only one? There can be little things like that. You have to define from a gameplay perspective what you want if you want your architecture to last. You can, of course, make your architecture like function with both, but you always add more complexity, and complexity is usually bad. Try to keep it as simple as possible. And just when you think about it, just try to make it so that the ideas you have up front are written down and you keep yourself to fundamental principles. Another example might be...
What would be those fundamental principles?
Yeah, for example, if I make a guild architect and I say I have a table and I never want to place anything on that table, that is a rule you make in your head.
Okay.
And you say, this is what I keep with.
Yeah.
But if you then say, I want to add candles on top of that table, now your system, of course, you can make it so it supports that.
But you're like making exceptions to that fundamental rule.
Yeah, basically. You make a fundamental rule, and it's like, this is what I designed the system for. And I think you should always design for the system with thought of like expansion and flexibility in mind. but I wouldn't go too specific. So if you say to yourself, my game is going to have tables, but the player cannot place anything on that table, I think that's a rule you should keep in mind and don't care about that. So that's purely from a game design perspective. Like, you should keep them in sync, in my opinion. So for example, with Guild Architect, William was like, I want to place stuff on the table. So that is now a rule that, okay, you can stack multiple items basically.
Yeah, and then you make like the rules of, okay, I can't put multiple tables on top of each other, but I can only put like candles and like plates and whatever.
Yeah, for example, like clutter you can place on furniture, but you cannot place furniture on furniture. Those are like the game design things.
Yeah.
And these are the things you keep in mind. For example, if William would say tomorrow, hey, I want to place tables up on top of each other.
Or like a chair on top of a table.
That's going to be, that's going to be a problem. Like, we can make it work, but then you are abusing your system.
Yeah, you're breaking it basically.
Yeah.
And that's maybe then another question is because in Forge Industry we had to break a lot of things. And notoriously our item system in Forge Industry, we refactored it like 7 times. Because at the end of the day, sometimes you can never plan perfectly, right?
Yeah.
How do you go and like gracefully refactor? Is there like a point where you're like, okay, we're not doing this like what you said now, of like, hey, we're not breaking this fundamental rule because we're not planned for it, or we're going to make an exception, or maybe there's a third option of, I'm just gonna rewrite everything from scratch. Because I think to a certain degree, you also gain experience, right? When making your game and like realizing that, hey, maybe this mechanic didn't really make sense at the end of the day, or this interaction. How do you decide between those 3 approaches and which ones would you take?
As always, it depends, because this is the answer everyone loves to hear always. For example, if we take a look at Forge Industry, I think there are a couple of reasons why it was bad and had to be refactored. First of all, no offense, Jamie didn't have experience with Unity. His implementation was lackluster from the get-go.
Okay.
So that's
we started with that sand foundation.
Yeah, so your lack of experience is already a reason why you have to refactor, and if that's the case, that's fine. You learn stuff.
Just at that point, maybe even better to not just refactor with
rewrite.
Just rewrite. Yeah, I think that's a big difference. Like refactoring is more like, okay, I'm gonna change part of this system, whereas rewrite is okay.
Yeah, you should just rethink everything with the knowledge you have today. Another reason is we didn't know mechanic-wise what we wanted for Forge Industry, I feel.
Yeah.
There were a lot of times that we changed what I just explained, like the fundamental rules. We should have thought about those probably from the start, and if we said, hey, we want multiple materials for an item, I don't know if this was the case from the get-go or not, I don't remember the way we wanted to implement it. This is something, if you change that rule, once again, you are abusing your system. Yeah. So those are 2 reasons why Forge Industry failed. What was the third thing?
Like just fully rewriting.
Yeah,
basically.
Fully rewriting is, especially when you're learning, it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Or when you see that you have to make it too dirty, so to say, to make it work. Like a simple example would be if William said, hey, I want to stack a table and a chair on top of each other, that I would be like, okay, from now on, a chair is considered clutter just like a candle.
Okay.
That is ugly, and it will come back to haunt you in the end.
Yeah, because then the question is, can I put anything on top of the chair?
Exactly.
And there's like too many. Yeah, we had like a lot of like those edge cases with Forge Industry where we're like, oh, but what if the worker like gets fired? Or what if this building does like something special? I think maybe this is also a good, like 2 things I have here. First of all, you make it sound like, game architecture actually starts with good game design.
Yes.
If you don't know what kind of game you're gonna make, your architecture is gonna be impossible.
You have to know your requirements before you can. I mean, if you say to me, we're going to make Guild Architect, and I just start writing code, and then you're like, but I wanted these mechanics. I'm like, I didn't take those into account.
Basically, every standard software like project, basically. I think another thing here that can help a lot with having like determining architecture is, okay, you have this rewrite, but that is maybe where also just like doing that like very quick game jam of your core game concept first before you start working on the big project can be an approach. It's something that we actually haven't really done. We should have done it with Forge Industry, where we had that like 1 weekend build of the game, but we kept building on it. We should have just been like, okay,
scrap it, start over.
Because we then knew what the relations were between a worker, an inventory, a road, and a building basically, and we could plan for that, but because we didn't know that when we started developing the game, there were a lot of mistakes there that we should have looked for.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's a very valid approach to just rapid prototype something, learn about the concepts, not take anything of architecture, code quality, whatever into account, just rapid prototyping, and then think like, okay, these are the mechanics that I want, this is how they have to interact, and then start over with a good base. I think that's a very valid approach.
One thing that we do say a lot on this channel is like, oh, first games, make them very quick. Like make them like probably a few months ideally. But we're also talking about, oh yeah, writing sustainable code and whatever. Because I think also our vision has changed upon that, where I think I heard you or William talk about it once, where the code you write, and it's maybe because you're software developers, should be meant to like scale extremely well, because that's something we didn't do with Forge Industry, where it didn't scale to hundreds of items. Where do you balance that, like the code I write is functional and I can make a game quick, versus the code I write scales well, but it's going to make my development times like 2-3 times as much?
Yeah, if this is your first game and you aim for 2 months of development time, for example, because you're making a small game, as you probably should, to just learn, I wouldn't take architecture into account that much.
Yeah, I think
it can be a shit game.
The bigger the scope is as well, the longer you're going to be developing, the more architecture is going to be a bottleneck like later in development. Like you're not going to notice bad architecture in like month 1 or 2 really.
No.
If you do, you have a big problem, but it's like month 8, suddenly you're gonna be stuck on something, and I think that's more of the problem.
Yeah. And I also think it's very genre dependent. For example, we make management and simulation games. Like these are very code heavy. These things require you to have good architecture. While if you're making a visual novel, you use an existing engine, you create the art and that's it.
Yeah, it's more like the story management and things like that, but the code can be like a kind of janky. It's like Undertale with their, 700 line if statements. It's like, it works because at the end of the day, it's like a one-off thing usually in those kinds of games where it's not the core of their game. And then you can go for that like quick and dirty approach and value it a bit more than that clean and scalable one.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, with Guild Architect, it has to be good from the get-go, because we know that adventurers have to interact with grid objects, with the tavern, with all the different sort of mechanics. So that means that we need to write each one of those properly, so everything can interact with each other. We have a very connected game in general, because adventurers can do a lot of things, but also individual components like the tavern can do a lot of things, like ordering things yourself. And everything is so connected that you can get either one big pile of spaghetti code, or you have to structure it very well so it can actually work. So it's very genre dependent, I feel.
We're reaching the end of this video, so like 80% of the people have dropped, so that's why I'm asking this now, because this is not applicable to 80% of the people. We're a team. And I think also architecture, when you're solo, you have that vision. But I think also clean architecture, yes, you have code standards and things like that, but it's harder to do as a team, right? How did you tell William, this is our mindset, this is like the approach we want to take in terms of code, these are like our guiding principles, and how do you like validate it? I know we do pull requests. Is that something where you need to put extra effort if you're in the team on maintaining that architecture, or no, if you have decent, competent programmers, it shouldn't be much of an issue?
I think it very much depends on your programmers and how they think about it and how in sync they are. In general, I think William and I are pretty in sync. We have ideas that are pretty much aligned with how it should be, which is makes it very easy to do the architecture. Very simple example is we both love using the singleton pattern, but we also love using events. If you're a programmer that doesn't like either of those, you probably will not gel well with our way of working in our architecture, and that's fine, but you have to find ways that work for you and your team. And we just happen to be in sync. So if you're a team, you just have to find common ground, I feel.
Very quick recap, basically. First of all, you need to know what kind of game you're making before you're actually gonna start writing it, because that's gonna be the defining factor for your architecture, right? If you can, make a little prototype to just figure out how does the code fit together. And then if you've done that, throw it all out and make a more larger scalable approach. And then scalable can depend on how big your scope is basically and the genre. And apart from that, just maybe think about like class diagrams is another good one, I think, that you should look into of like, how am I gonna fit all these points together?
Especially if you're getting started, it can help visualize how your code is interacting with each other.
I think at the end of the day, like there is no perfect approach to this anyway. I think just, already trying is going to get you a lot of the way, because you are going to be thinking about these things, and you're not gonna get it right the first time probably, but you're also not gonna get your game design right or whatever. So it is generally acceptable still, but planning it is going to save you a lot of time in the long run, because my God, I hated my life with Forge Industry. Please plan your games. I wasn't even a developer and I hated my life when I had to make this 700 different items, because it was just not meant to scale for it. And like opening our wiki causes like our game to freeze for like a second, because once again, we hadn't thought about the scale of these things. So I hope this gave you a bit more of an insight. I know this is not really that much of like a standard video we do, but I think there was some interesting topics that Thomas had to say here. Let me know what you thought of like these more technical videos, even though we're kind of engine agnostic here. What are some things you're interested in? We're not gonna do like code tutorials, but I think one thing that I pitched to him once, which was the original concept of this video, was like going through our code base and being like, oh, this is how we implement it here with like more concrete examples. Maybe one day we'll revisit that.
And if you want to see code tutorials anyway, we do have them on the channel, like 1 or 2.
We have like
link wherever.
Yeah. So if you like game development related content, you like the content we make on here, be sure to head down below and subscribe. It really helps us out, and you get 2 videos every week, which honestly, it sounds like a deal, no? Isn't it a deal?
It's an acceptable deal, I guess.
It's a solid deal. So go ahead, subscribe, and that's all I need to say. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.